Thanks everybody for being here and for inviting me here. I can't tell you how delighted I was to look at all this trouble that's brewing in paradise. There are so many things that I want to say, but let me just start by saying that every kind of resistance that has been discussed here in theory is being carried out in practice where I live. And so to begin with, I want to salute the people who live in one of the poorest countries in the world, India, for stopping some of the biggest corporations in their tracks for the last 5 or 6 years. So let's just say salam to them. So I don't know how far back in history to begin, so I'll lay the milestone down in the recent past. Let's say in the early 90s, when capitalism won its war against Soviet communism in the bleak mountains of Afghanistan, the Indian government, which had been for many years one of the leaders of the non-aligned movement, suddenly became a completely aligned country and began to call itself the natural ally of the US and Israel. And it opened up its protected markets to global capital. So what I'm going to talk about is roughly what happened in the last, let's say, 20, 21 years. And though what most people have been speaking about is about environmental battles, in the real world, actually, it's quite hard to separate these things. The war on terror, for example, the depleted uranium, the missiles, the fact that it was the military-industrial complex that actually pulled the US out of the Depression, out of the Great Depression. And since then, the economies of countries like America, many countries in Europe, certainly Israel, have depended very largely on the manufacture of weapons. And what good are weapons if they're not going to be used in wars? So it's absolutely essential. It's not just for oil or for natural resources, but for the military-industrial complex itself to keep going, that we need weapons. So today, as we speak, the US and perhaps China and India are involved in a battle for control of the resources of Africa. Tens of thousands of US troops are being sent, death squads and troops are being sent into Africa. The Yes We Can president has expanded the war from Afghanistan into Pakistan, there are drone attacks, killing children every day there. But just to look at the process of how things panned out in India, before I begin to read to you from the Broken Republic, which is actually called Walking with the Comrades here in the US. I just want to, sort of structurally put something in place. So in the 1990s, when the markets of India opened, when all the laws that protect labor were dismantled, when natural resources were privatized, and that whole process was set into motion, the Indian government basically opened two locks. One was the lock of the markets, and the other was the lock of an old 14th century mosque called the Babri Masjid, which was a disputed site between Hindus and Muslims because the Hindus believed that it was the birthplace of of Ram, and the Muslims, of course, use it as a mosque. And by opening that lock, it set into motion a kind of conflict between the majority community and the minority community, a way of constantly dividing people. And this is the main practice of anybody that is in power. How do you divide people? It doesn't, and so this was one of them. So the opening of these two locks unleashed two kinds of totalitarianism in India. One was economic totalitarianism, and the other was, Hindu fundamentalism. And both these processes manufactured two kinds of what the government calls terrorism. So you had Islamist terrorists, and you had today what the government calls Maoists, which means anybody who's resisting the project of civilization, of progress, of development, anybody who's resisting the takeover of their lands or the destruction of rivers and forests is today a Maoist. Yes, there are Maoists. They are the most militant end of a bandwidth of resistance movements, starting from the Gandhians to the Maoists. And what kind of strategy people will choose or adopt to resist the onslaught of global capital quite often is not an ideological choice. It's a tactical choice, depending on the landscape in which those battles are being fought. But everybody is a Maoist. I mean, just this morning I received an email from India talking about a woman called Soni Sori, an indigenous tribal woman who'd just been arrested the day before or a few days before I left India, and she's now being held and tortured and being asked to name some of us as. In the last 50 years, more than 30 million people have been displaced by big dams alone in India. And of course, most of those are indigenous people or people who live on the land, live off the land, I mean. So the results of 20 years of this kind of free market and this bogey of terrorism has resulted in the hollowing out of democracy. So I notice a lot of people use democracy as a good word. But actually, if you think of it, democracy today is not what democracy used to be. There was a time when the American government was toppling democracies in Latin America and all over the place. Today, it's waging wars to install democracy, because it has taken democracy into the workshop and hollowed it out. It has every institution of democracy, let's say in India, whether it's the courts, whether it's the parliament, whether it's the press, all of it has been hollowed out and harnessed to the free market. So you have these empty rituals. But what actually happens is it continues to militarize. It continues to become a police state, which is what has happened in India. So in the last 20 years, after we embraced the free market, 250,000 farmers have committed suicide because they have been driven into debt. 250,000 farmers. It has never happened in human history before. And yet, obviously when the establishment has a choice between suicide farmers and suicide bombers, which ones they're going to encourage. They don't mind that statistic because it helps them. They feel sorry, they make a few noises, but they keep doing what they're doing. Today, India has more poor people than all the poorest countries of Africa put together. And it has 80% of its population living on less than 20 rupees a day, which is less than 50 cents a day. So that is the atmosphere in which the resistance movements are operating. And of course, it has a media, which I don't know any other country which has so many news channels, all of them sponsored by either directly owned by corporations some of them mining corporations, infrastructure corporations, and some of them, more than 99% of all news is funded by corporate advertising. So you can imagine what's going on with that. We have a prime minister, the prime minister of the world's largest democracy, Manmohan Singh, who was more or less installed by the IMF. He has never won an election in his life. He never stood for, he stood for one election, lost, but after that he was just placed there. And he's the person who actually, when he was finance minister, dismantled all the laws and allowed global capital into India. At the northeastern states, you have the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, which allows soldiers to kill on suspicion. In central India, you have laws like, all over India, you have the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, which basically makes even thinking an anti-government thought a criminal offense, for which you can be jailed for more than 7 years. So this is the atmosphere that was being created, and the media was in this orgy of, these Maoist terrorists. They were conflating them with the Lashkar-e-Taiba, so you'd see them on TV with these sort of ski masks and AK-47s, and the middle class was literally baying for their blood. And at this time, I had written a couple of articles about the whole thing, where television anchors would just turn around and look at me as if I was crazy when I mentioned mining, What possibly accuse a corporation of malpractice? In so many words, it just says so. So it was around that time that a note was slipped under my door inviting me to go into the forest and walk with the comrades. So I'm going to read to you from that, just to give you a texture and a sense of what is going on there. The terse typewritten note slipped under my door in a sealed envelope confirmed my appointment with India's single biggest internal security challenge, which is what the Prime Minister called the Maoists. I'd been waiting for months to hear from them. I had to be at the Ma Danteshwari Mandir, that's temple, in Dantewada, Chhattisgarh, at any 4 given times on 2 given days. That was to take care of bad weather, punctures, blockades, transport strikes, and sheer bad luck. The note said, writer should have camera, tika, which is a bindi, and coconut. Meter will have cap, Hindi Outlook magazine, and bananas. The password will be Namaskar Guruji. Namaskar Guruji.